"Don't touch the glass," one of the ushers snapped at Isabel as her fingers hovered near the display case. "That violin's worth more than your future." Elijah heard it from across the marble lobby. He didn't look up. He simply squeezed the mop head, water trickling down his forearm, and whispered, "That's not even the good one." The usher blinked. "What did you just say?" Elijah straightened slowly, his shoulders calm under the faded janitor's uniform. He looked at the gleaming Stradivarius behind the glass, then back at the man guarding it like a dragon over treasure. "It's not even the good one. The bridge is bowed, strings too tight, sounds like a tin can in G. Drop a like if you've ever wanted to stand up to unreasonable rules like this, and subscribe to see how this strategy plays out. This one's going to be worth it." The usher faltered, staring at him as if the mop had grown teeth. Elijah said nothing else, just wrung out the mop and moved to the other side of the gala lobby. People turned away as he passed, noses wrinkled at his uniform. Elijah didn't mind. He was used to being invisible in spaces like this. What they didn't know was that invisibility could be a weapon. The velvet ropes cordoned off the auction items. A jeweled cello bow, a baton made of petrified rosewood, and the centerpiece, an antique Italian violin priced at $120,000. It sat under a spotlight, angled like a relic in a museum. Surrounding it were guests in silk dresses and bespoke tuxedos, sipping golden wine and murmuring about investment instruments and family endowments. Elijah kept cleaning. Isabel stood beside the violin, her eyes wide, her backpack still slung over one shoulder. No one looked at her. To them, she was the janitor's daughter, a brown-eyed shadow under fluorescent lighting. Cameron LeClaire entered 15 minutes late, wearing a cobalt blue tuxedo that probably cost more than Elijah's annual salary. He moved through the crowd like royalty, his smile all teeth and champagne confidence. The jewel of the night," Cameron announced, approaching the case. "Isn't she a beauty?" He tapped the glass once, drawing more attention. Elijah watched silently from the far corner. The mop bucket squeaked on polished tile. Cameron turned and spotted Isabel. "Oh, someone let the help's daughter pass the rope?" Isabel froze. She hadn't done anything, just stood a little too close. "She's with me," Elijah said evenly, still not looking up. "I already told your assistant." Cameron made a show of glancing around, then focused on Elijah like he'd just noticed a stain. "Ah, right, our janitor, of course." Then came the smirk. "It's good to dream, Mr. Elijah Hart." "Right, Hart. It's good to dream. But dreams don't pay for instruments like this. And frankly, it's irresponsible to fill a child's head with expectations you can't afford." Elijah stepped forward, mop still, in hand. "Didn't know hope had a price tag." "Oh, everything has a price tag," Cameron said smoothly, loud enough for the nearby donors to hear. "Some of us just accept reality sooner." The silence that followed was loud. Elijah held his daughter's gaze and said softly, "Just because something's behind glass doesn't mean it's untouchable." Cameron's eyes narrowed. "Let's keep things professional, Hart. We appreciate your work here. But remember your place." He turned away, motioning for a photographer to take his picture beside the case. Isabel gripped Elijah's sleeve, her fingers trembling. He knelt beside her. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded barely. "Good, because we're not done yet." She didn't know what he meant, not yet. But she saw the flicker of something in his eyes, a calm, deep fire that didn't match the mop, the bucket, or the uniform. Years ago, he might have burned down a stage with his hands. These days, he cleaned floors where others performed. But some performances didn't need applause. They needed patience. He led Isabel away from the velvet ropes as the crowd returned to their champagne and string quartets. As they walked down the hallway toward the staff corridor, Mara Winfield, Isabel's music teacher, stepped out from the faculty room. She saw the look on Elijah's face. She opened her mouth to say something, then thought better of it. Instead, she knelt to Isabel's level. "You still practicing for the winter audition?" Isabel hesitated, then nodded. Mara glanced between the two of them. "Good, I'm rooting for you." They disappeared into the stairwell. Behind them, Cameron's laughter echoed like cheap wine poured into a crystal glass. "Where are you watching from?" "Because this man just mocked a janitor in public. and he has no idea who Elijah Hart really is. He chose the wrong man to screw with. The next morning, Elijah stood outside the school auditorium, wiping down the glass doors with a steady hand. Inside, a line of students waited to audition for the Winter Scholarship Showcase, most dressed in designer jackets, shoes too polished for actual wear. Isabel stood near the end of the line, wearing the same blue cardigan she'd worn for the past 3 recitals. Her violin case, second-hand and taped at the seams, rested beside her shoes. Elijah's claw slowed over the glass as he watched the others whisper and glance her way. Some of the parents weren't subtle. "She's the janitor's girl, right?" Elena said she saw her practicing in the supply closet. "Shouldn't she be somewhere else?" Elijah's jaw clenched, but his expression didn't change. He moved on to the second door, keeping his back turned. You learn a lot when no one thinks you're listening. Inside, Cameron stood at the judges' table, flanked by 2 alumni donors. A clipboard rested near his hand, each applicant's name printed neatly with a section 4, scoring tone, posture, and interpretation. "Elena Delacroix," he called. A tall girl with perfect posture walked confidently to the front of the stage. Her dress shimmered under the warm lights. Her first note was flawless, the second even better. Elijah didn't bother watching the rest. He made his way to the maintenance closet in the east wing. It was cramped. Shelves of old trophies, bleach containers, and a folding chair jammed beside the water heater. In the far corner sat a violin stand made from 2 broken broomsticks and a stack of textbooks. Isabel's old metronome ticked quietly. He exhaled. The sound echoed in the small space. Back upstairs, Isabel's name was called. Elijah didn't go back. He couldn't. Not because he didn't believe in her, but because he knew what Cameron was capable of. He'd seen it before. People like that didn't need to scream to ruin lives. They just had to smile and check a box. When Isabel finally found him after the audition, she looked like someone had vacuumed the light from her chest. "They didn't let me finish." Elijah turned from the mop bucket. "What?" "I got 2 bars in, and Mr. Leclerc stopped me. He said I was playing the wrong piece, even though I practiced the new arrangement you showed me, said it showed I didn't follow instruction. But the sheet he had, it wasn't mine." Elijah's blood ran cold. He crouched to her level. "Are you sure?" She nodded hard. He held it up. It was someone else's name. He felt the floor drop from under him, but not in surprise, in confirmation. He stood slowly, pressing a hand to the closet door frame as he thought. She had practiced the correct version for weeks. He'd walked her through each variation, note by note. There was no mistake. Cameron had switched her sheet. "Did you tell anyone?" "No one believed me. Miss Winfield tried to ask, but he just..." She shook her head. "He said I should try again next year." Elijah closed his eyes. For a long time, he said nothing. Then he reached toward the top shelf, where a faded, weathered case had sat untouched for years. He pulled it down, ran his fingers over the leather straps. He opened it slowly. The instrument inside wasn't a showpiece. The varnish was dulled, the bridge slightly crooked. But the strings hummed faintly at his touch, as if recognizing an old friend. Isabel's eyes widened. "That's not mine." "No," Elijah said. "It's mine." She stared at it. "You played?" He smiled softly. "A long time ago." Silence filled the closet. Isabel stepped closer, eyes still locked on the violin. "Are you going to play again?" Elijah didn't answer, but that night, when she went to bed, she could hear it through the walls. Soft notes, precise, haunting, slipping through the cracks of time like dust-catching light. The sound of someone who hadn't just played before, but who'd never truly stopped. Next day at lunch, Isabel sat alone at the corner of the music hall courtyard, her sandwich untouched. Around her, the other students filled tables with laughter and gossip, swapping audition stories and checking class schedules. None of them looked her way, not since the audition. A few had seen the moment Cameron stopped her mid-performance. Fewer questioned why, and no one defended her, not out loud. Elijah watched from the janitor's supply shed across the quad, pretending to fix a leaking hose connection. His back was turned, but his ears were tuned in. Two boys from the strings program strolled past Isabel's table, speaking just loud enough to carry. I heard she didn't even know which piece to play. Her dad's the janitor, right? Probably taught her the wrong version. Why'd they even let her in the audition room? The second boy laughed, then made the screeching sound of a violin being dragged across the wrong key. Isabel stayed still. She didn't run. She didn't cry. She just lowered her head and stared at the crust of her sandwich like it might give her a different life if she waited long enough. That was the moment Mara Winfield finally stepped in. She crossed the courtyard with sharp footsteps and set her lunch tray down across from Isabel without a word. The boys quieted. A few other students raised their eyebrows. Mara ignored them. "You practiced the Chrysler arrangement, right?" she asked calmly. Isabel nodded slowly. "I have the sheet in my binder." "I know you do." Mara's voice was even, but her jaw had the tension of someone biting back fire. "I also know you've been practicing in a supply closet because the practice rooms are always mysteriously booked." Elijah's grip on the hose tightened. The rubber snapped a little under pressure. Isabel blinked. "You knew?" "I didn't want to believe it at first, but it's been happening too often, and I've seen how you work." She paused, then leaned in a little. "Elijah taught you, didn't he?" Isabel hesitated. Mara's expression softened. "It's okay. You don't have to hide that." She looked around, scanning for nearby faculty before continuing in a whisper. "I heard something yesterday. One of the old donors said your dad's name sounded familiar. Said he remembered him from Juilliard, years ago." Isabel's eyes widened. "I asked him twice. He swore Elijah used to teach master classes there, that he was supposed to be the next big thing." Isabel's voice was a whisper. "He never told me that." Mara smiled sadly. "Maybe it hurt too much." They sat in silence for a few moments. Then Mara's expression shifted, hardening. "I want to help you, but you need to trust me. Do you still have your audition sheet? The one you brought?" Isabel nodded. "Good. Bring it to me after school. I want to compare it with the one Cameron submitted to the review panel." Isabel's voice trembled. "Will it help? If he forged or swapped documentation, it could cost him more than just this scholarship." The bell rang before either of them could say more. Isabel picked up her tray, a little lighter on her feet. Across the quad, Elijah slipped back into the shed. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but sometimes what a father needed to hear wasn't an apology. It was someone else finally saying what he couldn't. That evening, Isabel brought him the binder. "Elijah," she said quietly. She only called him that when something serious was coming. He looked up from the laundry pile. "Miss Winfield told me." He didn't pretend not to know what she meant. She held out the sheet of music. Her fingers were steady. "Is it true?" He looked at the paper, then at her. "I used to teach it," he said. "This piece, in rooms bigger than this house, to students who couldn't hold a candle to your ear." "Why'd you stop?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he carefully took the sheet from her and folded it along the creases. Then he said, "Because one day I knew I'd rather teach you." And he meant every word. The music department's faculty lounge smelled faintly of varnish, espresso, and ambition. Mara Winfield sat at the back table, eyes scanning two nearly identical pieces of sheet music. The one Isabel handed her was clean, marked with Elijah's light pencil edits. The other, submitted to the scholarship panel, bore a different name and a different arrangement entirely, Chrysler's Preludium and Allegro, but not the version Isabel had practiced. She rubbed her temple and checked the staff login terminal. Cameron Leclerc's credentials had been used the morning of the audition to upload documents to the judging portal, 4 hours before Isabel played. Too neat, too deliberate. The office door opened. "Mara," Cameron greeted, stepping inside with a ceramic cup from the barista stand outside. "Working late?" She didn't look up. "Reviewing auditions." "Ah," he smiled, still clinging to the dream that one of these kids might be a prodigy. "One of them is." He chuckled, then leaned against the counter beside her. "We both know talent isn't enough. Presentation, polish, pedigree, it all matters." She turned toward him. "You submitted the wrong sheet for Isabel Hart's audition." His smile didn't falter. "Are you accusing me of something?" "I'm observing something, and I'd like an explanation." Cameron took a long sip from his cup. "She played the wrong piece." That's all the explanation the panel needed. She didn't. You altered her submission. He moved closer, dropping his voice. You know how this works. We can't award a scholarship to someone who doesn't reflect the Academy's reputation. Our donors expect a certain standard. She met that standard. No, he said, sharp now. She met your standard, not theirs, not mine. Mara stood up slowly, voice controlled. So you sabotaged her? I protected the school. Let's not make this dramatic. Her hands trembled as she packed her things. I'm reporting this. To whom? HR? The board? They're here tonight for the gala. You think they'll listen to a teacher over the man who built the donor list? He stepped aside, smiling thinly. Don't forget who signs your contract. She stared at him. For a moment, she didn't know what to say, but the look in her eyes told him. This wasn't over. That evening, Elijah stood alone in the auditorium balcony as the gala guests filtered in below. Strings of white lights draped the arches, casting soft gold against polished wood. The stage was already set for the evening showcase. He watched the stage hands adjust the lighting, the sound tech fine-tune the overhead mics. In the center, the glass case stood once again, housing the $120,000 violin, the same one Cameron had called a dream. Elijah didn't watch the instrument. He watched the man standing in front of it, smiling for photos. Cameron LeClaire, confident, impeccable, untouchable, for now. A voice pulled Elijah from his thoughts. Didn't expect to see you here. He turned. It was Gregor Masson, a former violinist turned foundation board member. Older now, with a cane and deep-set eyes, but unmistakable. Elijah offered a quiet nod. Didn't expect to be seen, Gregor chuckled. I never forget a hand position. You had one of the best bowing arms I've ever seen. What happened? Elijah's eyes fell to the stage. Life, daughter, choices. You disappeared. I had to. Gregor followed his gaze. She's the girl who auditioned, the one Cameron dismissed. She's better than I was. There was silence for a moment, then Gregor said, You still play? Not for years, but I never forgot how. You know what he did to her? Elijah nodded. You going to let that stand? Elijah's voice was calm. No. Gregor patted his shoulder. Then make sure they remember you, not just for who you were, but for what you still are. Backstage, Isabel stood behind the velvet curtain in her simple dress, hugging her case. She wasn't on the program, not anymore, but Mara had given her permission to wait in the wings, just in case. In case of what, she didn't know. She looked down at the violin Elijah had given her the night before. His violin. The strings had been changed, the pegs reset, but it still carried the sound of something older than shame. A tap on the shoulder startled her. It was Mara. Stay close, she whispered. Why? Because something's about to happen. Above, Elijah took one last look at the stage. Then he made his way down the stairs, across the polished hallway, and toward the room where the real performance would begin. The man who once played for the world was about to clean up more than floors. He was about to clean up a lie. Mara stood backstage, clipboard pressed tightly to her chest. She could feel the weight of Cameron's gaze from across the velvet curtain, but she didn't flinch. The lights in the auditorium dimmed as the MC introduced the evening's main act, Dr. Yoon Sang-ho, a world-renowned violinist flown in as the gala's headliner. Except Dr. Yoon wasn't coming. 10 minutes earlier, just as he stepped out of the green room, he collapsed. Low blood sugar, the EMT had said. He was stable, but in no shape to perform. The gala director had panicked, the guests were already seated, and Cameron was on the verge of losing the one performance the entire fundraiser was built around. We'll call a backup, Cameron had barked. Find someone, anyone from the conservatory. There isn't time, the director whispered. Everyone's off site. Closest musician's 40 minutes away. Cameron's jaw tightened. Then stall. But Mara had already turned and walked into the shadows, past the costume racks, past the prop table, toward the hallway leading to the rear access corridor, toward the janitor's closet. Elijah was already waiting, mop tucked neatly beside the sink, hands freshly scrubbed. He stood like a man who had already made the decision, like he'd been waiting for this moment longer than anyone could guess. "Doctor," Yoon fainted, Mara said, breath short. "They need a replacement." "I heard." "You knew this would happen?" "No," Elijah replied. "But I knew something would." She hesitated. "Elijah, if you walk onto that stage, they'll see you." "Good." She looked into his face and saw something she hadn't expected. Peace. "Elijah, it's not just about showing them. It's about her. If this backfires, it won't." He walked past her without another word. Back in the wings, Isabel stood behind the curtain, fingers clenched around the neck of her violin case. The muffled voice of the MC echoed through the auditorium. We apologize for the sudden change. Due to an unexpected health issue, Dr. Yoon is unable to perform tonight. However, we do have..." There was a pause, a long one. Then, "a special guest, someone who stepped forward in a moment of need." The curtain opened, and Elijah walked onto the stage. There was a moment of collective confusion. The crowd blinked. Some shifted uncomfortably. A janitor in pressed khakis, a gray dress shirt, and polished shoes stood alone in the spotlight. Cameron, from the VIP row, stood halfway out of his seat. "What the hell is this?" Mara watched from the side stage, pulse thundering. The MC handed Elijah the mic, unsure. Elijah took it gently, then glanced toward the crowd. "My name is Elijah Hart. Most of you know me as the maintenance staff at Eastbridge Academy. I've worked here for 7 years. There were murmurs. "But before that," he continued, "I taught master-level theory and performance at Juilliard. I played with 3 national symphonies, and once I stood on this same kind of stage in a very different suit." He paused, letting the words settle. "Tonight, I'm not here to reclaim anything. I'm here because my daughter was told she didn't belong, because someone decided that money determines worth, because someone tried to silence her talent by sabotaging her chance." Now the murmurs turned sharp. Tension spread across the room, like a wire drawn tight. "And because silence has a sound," he said quietly, "you just have to know how to listen for it." He walked to the center, opened the case Mara had placed on the bench, and lifted the violin. His fingers found their place like they had never left. When the bow touched the strings, the first note soared, warm, aching, perfect. The room fell breathless. He played with no flourish, no pretense, just clean technique and pure emotion, each note pulled from a memory and laid bare under the lights. It wasn't just skill, it was mastery. People stopped breathing. Even Cameron sat frozen, jaw tight, unable to look away. When Elijah finished, there was no applause at first, just a stunned, reverent silence. Then, slowly, the room erupted. The standing ovation began in the back row, then spread like fire through velvet seats. Elijah bowed once, placed the violin back in its case, and turned without a word. As he exited the stage, he passed Mara. He didn't speak, but she caught the faintest glint in his eye. And for the first time in years, it wasn't shame. It was power. Backstage, Isabel could barely move. She'd just watched her father play the violin with a kind of certainty that didn't match anything she knew about him, at least not until now. The man who packed her lunches, repaired leaky faucets, and came home with bleach on his shirt had played like he belonged on a global stage. She still hadn't exhaled. "Elijah," Mara whispered, catching up to him in the hallway outside the performance wing. "You didn't just buy us time. You changed the room." He shook his head. "I didn't do it for the room." Mara followed his gaze down the corridor. Isabel stood there, case in hand, eyes locked on her father like she didn't recognize him, but wasn't afraid. "She should be next," Elijah said. Mara looked hesitant. "She's not on the program. Cameron will fight it." "I know. That's why it needs to happen now." Before she could argue, they heard the clack of dress shoes echoing behind them. Cameron Leclerc appeared, face taut, expression carved from glass. "Leave us," he told Mara. She hesitated, then stepped aside, but didn't walk far. "Elijah," Cameron said, smoothing his suit front. "That little stunt you pulled, that's not how this school works." Elijah remained still. "You used a medical emergency to sneak in a personal performance. Do you have any idea how that makes us look?" I think it made the room listen. Cameron's nostrils flared. This school runs on structure, on credibility. You don't just insert yourself into a gala because you've got a sob story and a beau. Elijah stared at him. She deserves a fair shot. Cameron's smile turned cold. She had her shot. She blew it. No, Elijah said evenly. You rigged it. For the first time, Cameron hesitated. Elijah stepped closer, his voice low. You submitted the wrong piece to the review board. You made sure her audition would look like a failure before she even played a note. You can't prove that. I don't have to. Mara can. Cameron glanced behind Elijah. Mara stood at the end of the hallway, silent witness. I've seen both scores, she said quietly. They don't match, and your login credentials are stamped on the submission time. Cameron's jaw clenched, but he covered quickly. Even if I did, you think they'd care? This board doesn't run on merit. It runs on trust, image, control. You won't win. Elijah tilted his head. That's the difference between us. I don't need to win. I just need to be heard. A door opened behind them. Gregor Masson stepped out, cane tapping gently against the tile. Funny thing about truth, he said, voice calm. Once someone hears it played right, they can't unhear it. Cameron paled. Let the girl play, Gregor added, or I'll speak to the board myself about all of this. There was no room left for maneuvering, no angle Cameron could spin. His voice was barely above a whisper. Fine, she can play, but she's not winning anything. Gregor raised an eyebrow. We'll see about that. The stage manager slotted Isabel in without fanfare. There was no program adjustment, no announcement, just her name and the slow hush of a curious audience when she stepped onto the stage with a plain, patched violin case and a calm that didn't belong to a 12-year-old. She walked to the center like she'd done it in her dreams. She opened the case. The old violin inside had been cleaned, polished, but not disguised. It looked like it had lived. She raised the bow. The first note rang out soft, but full. It wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. It had gravity. And then she played. Not just technically correct, emotionally true. Every movement she made bore the fingerprint of Elijah's quiet tutelage. Her transitions between phrases, her bow control, her timing, they spoke to a kind of instinct that couldn't be taught in classrooms padded by privilege. The audience leaned in. Mara watched from the side stage, her hand over her heart. Cameron sat frozen, unable to look away. And Elijah, standing at the back of the hall, watched his daughter become something more than what anyone expected of her. When the final note faded, the silence felt holy. Then came the applause. Not polite, not indulgent. Earned. Isabel lowered the bow and blinked into the lights. For a second, she looked lost. Then she found her father's face in the shadows and smiled. She didn't need a trophy. She already had what mattered, but the board would have something to say about the rest. The board met in private immediately after the gala concluded. Not in the usual conference room, but in a reserved side salon where donors sipped aged wine under portraits of past benefactors. Gregor Masson sat at the head of the table, cane resting beside his chair, expression unreadable. Cameron LeClaire stood stiffly near the window, arms crossed, watching the city skyline beyond the glass as if it offered him a way out. I've reviewed the documents, Gregor began, placing a folder on the polished table. Miss Winfield's notes, the time-stamped logs, and the 2 versions of the audition sheet. The room fell quiet. There's a clear discrepancy between what Isabel Hart was given to prepare and what was submitted to the panel. One of the board members, a woman in her 60s with a pearl pin on her lapel, leaned forward. Cameron, is this true? He didn't answer right away. I acted in the interest of the school's reputation, he said at last. We can't afford to lower standards for sentiment. Gregor's brow furrowed. So, you're admitting to altering the submission? I made a judgment call. The girl was out of her depth. She wasn't, said another board member, this one a younger man with sharp eyes. I was in the audience tonight. She outperformed half the scheduled acts. She played with an instrument that looked like it came from a pawn shop, Cameron snapped. This academy is a place of excellence, not charity. And yet, Gregor said evenly, somehow, both Elijah and Isabel Hart managed to remind this audience what excellence really sounds like. Silence again. Gregor opened a side drawer and retrieved a small envelope. There's something else. He pulled out a photo, faded but clear. It showed a much younger Elijah Hart, bow in hand, standing beside Gregor at a Juilliard faculty recital. This man was once one of us, a professor, a performer, a mentor, and we've had him cleaning floors for 7 years while his daughter was mocked in our halls. Gregor stood slowly. I'm recommending 3 actions. First, a formal apology to the Hart family, issued by this institution. Second, full scholarship reinstatement for Isabel, retroactively applied. Third, Cameron Leclerc's immediate resignation. Cameron's face drained. You can't. I can, Gregor interrupted. And I will. Your judgment isn't compromised. It's bankrupt. The vote was unanimous. Cameron didn't wait to argue. He walked out without a word, the door closing behind him with a quiet, final click. Outside, in the courtyard where it had all started, Elijah sat on the low stone bench under the courtyard lights. Isabel sat beside him, violin case resting on her knees, fingers running absently over the leather handle. You knew this would happen, she said softly. I hoped, Elijah answered, but hope only works if you're ready when the moment comes. She leaned against his arm, silent for a beat. You could have told me before, about who you were. I didn't want who I was to define who you'd become. She looked up at him. It wouldn't have, but it would have made me proud sooner. He didn't answer, but the quiet smile on his face said everything. Footsteps approached. Mara stepped into the light with a small envelope in hand. From the board, she said. They wanted you to have it before morning. Elijah opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet. Confirmation of Isabel's full scholarship, backdated, sealed with the Academy's insignia. Beneath it, a handwritten note from Gregor. True talent needs no permission. Welcome back. Elijah handed the paper to Isabel without a word. She read it, then clutched it to her chest. Mara smiled. And there's one more thing. Gregor wants to add a final performance to next season's gala. A father-daughter piece. Said he's never seen a standing ovation that felt more earned. Elijah blinked. It's her time now. She wants to do it, Mara said, but only if you'll play beside her. Isabel looked up, eyes bright. Please? He didn't speak right away, but then he nodded, and across the courtyard, under a sky full of soft city glow, the past and future quietly shook hands. 2 months later, the Academy's winter recital unfolded beneath a crisp December night sky. The auditorium filled with fresh anticipation. The final performance hadn't been announced on the program. No one outside the faculty and board knew what was coming. Whispers floated like mist above the crowd. Rumors of a surprise act. Speculation about who had earned the coveted closing spot. Backstage, Isabel tightened the last peg on her violin and ran her fingers over the polished wood. Her hands didn't shake. Her breath was steady. She wore a simple dress, pale blue with silver accents, but her posture was that of a seasoned artist. Elijah stood nearby, black suit freshly pressed, his own violin resting in the crook of his arm. He wasn't performing as a teacher, a father, or a janitor tonight. He was returning to the stage not to reclaim something lost, but to pass something forward. You ready? He asked quietly. Isabel nodded. I've never been more ready. Gregor appeared from the wings, smiling at them both. The stage is yours, he said. I told them we'd be ending with something timeless. Don't prove me wrong. Elijah chuckled. That depends on whether the strings hold. Gregor turned and made his way to the microphone at center stage. The applause from the previous performer had died down, replaced by curious murmurs. We have one final act. For you tonight, Gregor said, voice resonant. Not listed in your programs, but perhaps the most meaningful performance this stage will host this season. Please welcome Elijah and Isabel Hart. A hush spread through the auditorium like a held breath. Then the curtains opened. Father and daughter stepped into the light together. There was no speech, no preamble. Elijah nodded once, and Isabel lifted her bow. The piece began slow, Bach's double violin concerto, in D minor. A duet that demanded more than just technical ability. It required connection. They moved in perfect rhythm. Elijah's tone grounded the piece with aged grace, while Isabel's voice soared over his, bright and confident. It wasn't flawless in the way a machine plays flawlessly. It was human, lived in. The crowd leaned forward, enthralled, not just by the sound, but by the story they knew, or thought they knew, now unfolding in music. Mara stood backstage, her arms crossed, watching with quiet awe. She'd seen Isabel rise from isolation and ridicule to command the room. She'd watched Elijah shed years of quiet burden in the span of a single night. In the front row, some of the same donors who once questioned Isabel's presence now sat speechless, their prior assumptions unraveling with every note. When the final chords landed, resonant, firm, unforgettable, there was a moment of pure stillness. Then, like a wave crashing through the room, applause, not polite, not reserved, thunderous. Isabel bowed, cheeks flushed, eyes wide with joy. Elijah placed a hand on her shoulder, bowing with her. As they turned to leave the stage, Gregor intercepted them in the wings. That, he said, eyes misted, was the kind of moment that rewrites legacies. Isabel beamed. Can we do it again next year? Gregor laughed. I was hoping you'd ask. The following morning, Elijah returned to work, not because he had to. The board had offered him a formal teaching position in the spring term, an honorary return to faculty. But he still arrived at 6:45 a.m., keys jangling at his belt, checking the boilers and restocking paper towels in the student lounges. Because some things didn't need changing. Outside the music building, Isabel waited at the stone bench with a thermos of coffee in her hands. You know you don't have to do this anymore, she said as he sat beside her. I know, he replied, accepting the thermos. But I like knowing this place works, even if no one sees it. She tilted her head. They see it now. He smiled softly. Maybe, but that's not why I started. She leaned into him, quiet for a moment, then said, Can I use your violin for the conservatory auditions next month? He looked at her, surprised. Not the new one? She shook her head. That one sounds like who I'm becoming. But yours sounds like where I came from. He exhaled, nodding once. Then it's yours. They sat in silence. City. Sounds waking around them, the weight of the moment unspoken, but deeply felt. And in the distance, a few early students passed by, nodding politely to the man they once walked past without notice. But now they knew, and they would remember. The weeks leading up to the National Conservatory auditions were grueling. Isabel practiced for hours every day after school, balancing scales and phrasing with homework and scholarship paperwork. Elijah watched quietly, never correcting unless she asked, never offering more than she needed. This was her journey now. Still, he was always there. Some nights, she practiced in the same hallway he once mopped. The acoustics were surprisingly good, warm, resonant, and the irony wasn't lost on either of them. She played where people once avoided eye contact with him, where his presence had gone unnoticed for years. Now, the same hall echoed with sound that made faculty pause and listen. One evening, just after 9 p.m., Mara appeared at the end of the hallway, holding a sealed envelope. Judge's program schedule came in early, she said, waving it slightly. Want to know your slot? Isabel nodded, lowering her violin. Mara handed her the envelope. Inside was a printed confirmation. 10:45 a.m., room 302, Conservatory Main Hall, adjudicated by a panel of 4. One name on the list made Elijah raise an eyebrow. Alan Devereaux, he murmured. You know him? Isabel asked. Elijah nodded. We were in the same orchestra years ago. Brilliant mind, brutal critic. He once told a prodigy their bowing was like a dying fish flopping across string. Mara winced. Well, that's charming. Fair, though, Elijah added. He doesn't pull punches, but he listens when someone earns it. Isabel folded the schedule. Then, I'll make sure I'm worth listening to. The conservatory audition hall smelled of varnish, old paper, and tension. Students filled the waiting room, some pacing, others practicing quietly with mute tips on their bows. Most wore brand-name suits or polished dresses. Isabel sat in a navy blouse, slacks, and Elijah's worn violin case on her lap. A few others glanced at her case with thin smiles. Someone whispered, "Vintage thrift find?" Another added, "Poor thing must have gotten the donor's pass." Isabel didn't react. She unlatched the case, checked the tuning, and tightened the bow. Her motions were clean, precise. She didn't need them to believe in her. She needed them to listen. A voice called from the doorway. "Isabel Hart, room 302. She stood, adjusted her collar, and stepped forward. Inside the audition room, 4 judges sat behind a long table. Devereux sat furthest left, glasses perched low on his nose, pen already tapping against his pad. The others nodded politely. She stood at the center, bowed slightly, and announced her piece. When she lifted the violin, the air changed. From the first note, the tone was undeniable, rich, steady, unmistakably hers. She didn't just play the music, she interpreted it. Her dynamics breathed, her timing flexed where it should and held steady when it mattered. Devereux raised his head. The tapping pen stopped. By the second movement, his brow furrowed in a way Elijah had seen before. Not confusion, but curiosity. When the final note rang out, Isabel let it hover for half a second before lowering her bow. Silence. Then, "Thank you," said one of the judges. Isabel bowed and left without waiting for smiles or praise. She'd been raised to understand that applause wasn't the measure, integrity was. Outside, Elijah sat on a bench, hands folded. She walked straight to him, set the case down, and exhaled. "How'd it go?" "I don't know," she said, but Devereux stopped tapping his pen. Elijah smiled. "That's a symphony in itself." Mara joined them minutes later, holding 2 cups of vending machine coffee. "Well?" she asked. "I did what I came to do," Isabel said. "That's all any of us can ask." 3 days later, the acceptance letter arrived in a plain envelope with a gold conservatory seal. Isabel tore it open with hands that trembled for the first time in weeks. Elijah didn't read over her shoulder. He waited. Then she turned around, beaming. Full scholarship, top placement, first pick for the youth ensemble. He closed his eyes briefly, letting the weight of years lift without a sound. She ran into his arms, nearly knocking the breath out of him. And somewhere behind them, the past watched in silence as the future took a step forward. The conservatory acceptance didn't just change Isabel's future, it began shifting the school's present. Within weeks, Elijah noticed subtle changes. The same faculty who once nodded to him, without making eye contact, now greeted him by name. Some even paused to ask his opinion. On repair work, on music, on the school's history. It wasn't a full transformation, but it was enough to notice. Isabel, meanwhile, was asked to mentor 2 younger students ahead of their spring auditions. The same practice rooms that once felt cold and distant now opened easily at her knock. She used Elijah's old fingerboard diagrams and breathing techniques, patiently passing down every piece of insight he'd taught her. One afternoon, as she packed up after rehearsal, she found a small envelope on the music stand. No name, just the Academy's crest. Inside, an invitation. "You are cordially invited to perform at the Eastbridge Winter Gala, main stage feature." Elijah read it twice. "That's not just a slot. That's the slot. The closing performance." Isabel looked up. "Should I do it?" "You earned it." She held the paper in her hands, silent. "I want to play the Elgar piece." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "That's bold. It's emotional. Personal." "I know," she said. "That's the point." In the weeks that followed, Isabel poured herself into the piece. Elgar's violin concerto wasn't technically the most difficult work she'd performed, but it demanded emotional maturity. It was about memory and loss, hope and restraint, everything she'd carried through the years. Elijah listened every evening, offering small adjustments, finger pressure here, bow speed there. But mostly he let her find her own voice within the piece. One night, she finished a difficult passage and turned to him. "Why did you stop playing?" she asked suddenly. Elijah paused. The question hung in the air. "My wife passed," he said quietly, "and everything I played started to sound like grief. I couldn't find the music anymore, not in my hands, not in my head." Isabel nodded slowly. "But it's back now?" He smiled gently. "It never really left. I just needed a reason to remember." The night of the gala arrived with fresh snow on the ground. The auditorium shimmered under soft, golden lights. Velvet programs were passed out at the doors. Isabel Hart's name, printed in silver foil, final act of the evening. Elijah stood in the wings as she stepped into the light. She wore the same navy blouse from her conservatory audition, pressed and clean, no sequins, no glamour, just presence. The crowd quieted. She lifted her bow and began. The Elgar piece unfurled like memory. Her playing was tender but strong, filled with aching beauty. The opening phrases carried longing, the middle movement, a soft defiance. Every note carried not just her talent, but her story. She wasn't just performing. She was speaking, without words, about perseverance, about rising without anger, about love in quiet forms. Elijah watched with his hand resting lightly on the curtain's edge. He wasn't nervous. He was proud. And beneath that, something deeper. Peace. When Isabel reached the final note, she let it hang, not for drama, but for closure. Then she lowered her violin, and for one heartbeat, no one moved. Then the room rose, unanimous. Applause thundered, not just for skill, not just for music, for everything she had carried, for everything she had become. Backstage, Gregor greeted her with misted eyes and a firm handshake. "You've made this school better," he said simply. Tonight, we all witnessed it. Isabel turned to Elijah. "Want to go home?" He nodded, but before they left, she handed him something, a small envelope. "What's this?" "A formal invitation," she said. "To teach, full-time. Conservatory faculty sent it yesterday." Elijah opened the envelope, eyes scanning the page. "Looks like they want me back." "They should," Isabel said. "You never left." Elijah looked at the stage one last time. Lights dimmed now, echoes fading. Then he smiled, not for what he'd regained, but for what he'd helped build. Spring arrived slowly, the way it always did in Eastbridge, ice melting in streaks across the pavement, buds appearing overnight on trees that had looked dead for months. For Isabel, the thaw mirrored her own life. No longer navigating school halls with lowered eyes, she now walked through campus as someone seen, not just for talent, but for resolve. She still practiced every morning before class, but now in the open rehearsal hall. Others sometimes watched through the glass, some even asked to join. Elijah, meanwhile, had accepted the conservatory's faculty offer, not because he wanted prestige, but because he saw value in presence. His first class was a mixed group of scholarship students, most from backgrounds like Isabel's, quiet, overlooked, but hungry. He didn't teach them scales first. He handed them sandpaper. "Your first job is to sand your own bridge," he said, "because no two violins are the same, and no two hands are either. If you're going to learn from me, it starts with knowing your instrument by touch, not just by sound." The students stared, confused but curious. He smiled. They'd understand soon enough. One afternoon, Isabel met Mara in the old courtyard, where everything had first come apart. Mara leaned against the stone bench, arms crossed. "You've heard the rumors, right?" "Which ones?" Isabel asked. "They're naming the new practice wing after someone." Isabel tilted her head. "Who?" Mara smirked. "You already know." It didn't seem real until the formal announcement arrived, gold lettering on thick cardstock, addressed to both Isabel and Elijah. The Heart Music Wing. Dedication ceremony, May 14th. The school hadn't renamed a structure in over 30 years, and never for a faculty member who'd once scrubbed its floors. The morning of the dedication, Isabel wore a navy blazer with gold trim and stood beside Elijah as faculty donors and students gathered in front of the new wing's arched entrance. A red cloth covered the name, etched into the stone. Gregor stepped forward to speak. "Legacies aren't always built in classrooms," he began. "Sometimes they're built quietly, in service closets and practice rooms, in long hours, unseen sacrifices, and truths too easily ignored. Today we honor a man who reminded us what music education is truly about, and a young woman who proved that excellence has no zip code." He turned to Elijah. "Mr. Hart, would you do the honors?" Elijah stepped forward, fingers steady, and pulled the cloth away. The Heart Music Wing. The letters gleamed in the morning light. For a moment, no one moved. Then came the applause, strong, respectful, sincere. Elijah didn't speak. He just stepped back and placed a hand on Isabel's shoulder. She leaned slightly into him, not for support, for unity. Later that evening, Isabel sat in her room, polishing her violin. She ran the cloth along its curves with care, pausing at the spot where the wood had darkened from years of use. "Elijah," she called. He appeared in the doorway. "I want to play something tomorrow, at the dedication dinner." He raised an eyebrow. "You've already played at every major event this semester." "I know," she said, "but this one's different." He stepped into the room. "What piece?" She looked up, a quiet grin forming. "Your arrangement. The one you used to teach in New York. The Chrysler version." He blinked. "That's not light work. I'm not who I was when you first taught it." He nodded slowly. "Number, you're better." The next night, the dedication dinner filled the conservatory ballroom. Long tables lined with string lights, soft jazz in the background, and framed photographs of student ensembles from across the years. When Isabel took the small stage with her violin, there was no announcement, no program listing, just her and the instrument. She began with a few quiet notes, familiar to Elijah the moment he heard them. The Chrysler arrangement. But it wasn't just a performance, it was a bridge between past and present, between the man who once walked away from music and the girl who'd carried it forward. Elijah stood at the back of the room, watching every note land like a memory given back to him. She finished without flourish, just truth. And when the applause came, he didn't clap. He just smiled, because nothing more needed to be said. The summer session began with new faces and a sense of anticipation. For the first time in the Academy's history, the Heart Music Wing stood open not just as a building, but as a symbol. Students from all backgrounds applied, drawn by whispers of a program that valued talent over wealth, heart over heritage. Elijah's first summer class opened with 12 students, each of them different in tone and temperament, but united by one thing: hunger to learn. He didn't give a lecture. He walked to the center of the room, set down a battered metronome, and looked each student in the eye. "This is the beat of your practice, not mine, not your parents', yours. If you chase someone else's rhythm, you'll always be late." Then he handed out the first exercise, a piece composed by Isabel. A girl with bright eyes in the front row raised her hand. "Is this the same Isabel Hart from the dedication?" Elijah smiled faintly. "That's the one. You taught her?" "She taught me too." Meanwhile, Isabel had taken up her spot at the conservatory, thriving under pressure, finding her own way through master classes, rehearsals, and recitals. But she returned every other weekend to the academy, not because she had to, because she wanted to. On those visits, she'd sit quietly at the back of Elijah's classroom, taking notes, offering tips, sometimes playing along when a student needed help. Her favorite thing to do, though, was visit the stone bench in the courtyard, the one where Mara had once handed her a lifeline and where everything had started to change. She still brought coffee, one for her, one for Elijah. "You ever think we'd end up here?" she asked one morning. "No," he said, "but I always hoped." She sipped slowly. "The head of youth competitions asked me to speak this fall." "Keynote." He raised an eyebrow. "Planning to accept?" "I will," she said, "but not as a rising star." He tilted his head. "I want to speak as someone who was told no," she continued, "as someone who was laughed at for where I came from. I want to remind them what it looks like to rise without stepping over others." Elijah didn't say much. He just reached into his pocket and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. Her eyes widened. "Is that—" He nodded. "The tuning fork from my Juilliard days. Never gave it away before." She unfolded the cloth gently. The silver fork caught the light, etched with a barely visible E. "Your pitch is better than mine ever was," he said, "but that's not why I'm giving it to you." She looked up. "I'm giving it to you because you'll know when to listen, even when no one else does." That fall, Isabel took the stage at the youth competition keynote, a full auditorium of students, teachers, and judges watching. She wore a plain black dress, no sparkle, no flash. "My name is Isabel Hart," she began. I grew up practicing in janitor closets. I learned theory from a man no one bothered to ask about. And my first violin cost less than most of you spend on concert shoes. A soft ripple moved through the audience. But I'm here because none of that stopped me. And if you're sitting there wondering if you belong in a room full of last names and donors and polished resumes, let me tell you something. You do. She held up the tuning fork. My father gave me this, not because I need help staying in tune, but because sometimes, when everything feels off-key, you need to be the one who knows where true pitch begins. The applause was slow, then steady, then full, because she hadn't just spoken truth, she'd given permission. Back home, Elijah watched the stream replay in the empty music wing, eyes on the screen. When Isabel finished her speech, she stepped back, bowed, and smiled. And in that moment, Elijah saw it fully. She wasn't just his daughter, she was her own force. And somewhere in a quiet corner of the music wing that now bore their name, a group of students tuned their instruments, not to perfection, but to purpose. Subscribe and don't miss our next story. Single dad? Janitor was laughed at for buying $5 shoes until he cashed a check that made the CEO gasp out loud. Trust me, you'll feel it.